We are live.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening, good evening, good evening. We were minding our business, living the life in our native home. You use us as bait to trap our men and bring us to a foreign space quite unknown. En route, you stripped us, didn't feed us, raped us, tried to beat us. You took our men trying to defend us and used them as a weapon to defeat us. Broken and bothered, it was a matter of surviving. With all of that oppression, we had to remain silent. Forced to cook, clean, and be at master's beckon and call, we had to remain silent. Crying out, giving birth to children we did not desire, we had to remain silent. Doing a woman's job and still required to work in the field, we had to remain silent. When you sold our protection, our men, our shields, we had to remain silent. Then a scary thing happened. It was subtle and intentional. It was spiteful and vengeful. And I'm sad to say that you achieved a goal, causing division between us and the other half of our completion. What are we to do? Fight for our rights as women? Fight for our rights as African Americans? Fight to be respected by you, by him, or by her? Through it all, we remained silent. Through it all, we didn't fret. Through it all, we didn't murmur. Through it all, we simply wept. But our silence was only to the natural eye. We wore it in the spirit realm so we could learn how to survive. You see, that full armor of God is why we are here today, because we wore it on our knees in prayer. It taught us how to fight. I slay, you slay, we slay. But like the 11th commandment that has kept us focused and our eyes on the prize, we have come to the place where it's our time to thrive. So hear our warning, because we want everyone to get a clue. Don't come for us unless we send for you. Where am I going in this, Pastor, you might ask? We have the right to be angry with all we have endured. We have the right to be angry because we literally had to claw our way up to the top from the bottom of the floor. We have the right to be angry with everything you did to keep your knees on our neck. We have the right to be angry, but our focus is not on you, because white man, white woman, black man, us sisters got next. Good evening, everyone. By way of introduction, my name is Reverend Dr. Nicole B. Simpson, and I am a certified financial planner. I want you to know tonight that I'm unapologetically Black and honored to be here with each and every one of you. Thank you, Tehran. Thank you, Lacey and Kappa Tau Kappa sorority for the invitations to participate in this Black History Month programming. Let me start by saying how I appreciate each and every one of you under the sound of my voice for taking the time out tonight, because one, I stand on the shoulders of our ancestors who have paved the way before me. And whenever given a platform to educate and empower, I take that part seriously. Two, I believe we have the ability to shift the conversation. And while I am inspired by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., I have a bit of Malcolm X's personality. We will achieve economic justice by any means necessary. Let me be clear, I'm not interested in getting any seats at any table. I believe at this season in our lives, we have enough education, resources, ingenuity, creative ideas, and witty inventions to create our own table. I also believe we have enough savviness in our lives that our table will be so litty that if we build it, they will come. And I'm so glad that you've come here tonight, because those that are not willing to revisit history are destined to repeat it. So my goal or my aim for this evening is to do three things. One, to outline the pivotal moments in history that have impacted the African American community economically. The second is to identify the economic impact of systemic racism in the insurance industry, the banking industry, and the real estate industry. And three, I want to say, where do we go from here? So ladies and gentlemen, buckle up and let's go on a journey. Let's begin by answering the question, how did slavery become about race? I indicated in my introduction that I am a right reverend, and I want to start off right with the good old Bible. The Bible articulates that slavery is wrong. So any Christian argument to dispute the justification begins right there. When you look at scripture, it provides a distinctly different definition of slavery according to biblical principles. The Mosaic law protected such servants in three primary scriptures. That if the servants were hurt, the slaveholder must release them. That can be found in Exodus, the 23rd chapter, verse number 26 and 27. Individuals could not be kidnapped and sold into slavery without the penalty of death. Exodus 21 and 16. And finally, if a slave managed to escape, they could not be returned back to their masters. That's found in Deuteronomy 23, 15 to 16. And so while you will hear that the Bible has been the tool that has provided that false justification, let us be clear together what the Bible has said. And in the identifying in the Bible, what is true is that slavery was always an economic solution for someone in debt. Let me introduce you to the one that may have had a hand in creating the calamity. Bartholomew de la Casa. He is a man that was a Spanish priest, and he was originally advocating for the use of African slaves instead of indigenous Americans, because Spaniards considered Africans to be stronger, more resilient, and healthier than the natives. Africans were not susceptible to death for some of the European diseases that plagued young America at the time and other areas in the world. And while Bartholomew de la Casas had a heart and a passion for the Indians or the indigenous people, he did not see Black people having a soul. He did not believe that they felt any pain. And so while making this argument, he inadvertently provided the Spanish government the endorsement of the new idea of slavery being based off of race rather than the medieval historical concept of slavery as a result of war and conquest. De la Casas later advocated that all slavery should be abolished, but the European emperors paid very little attention to his moral idea when there was so much wealth and power that was at stake. In late August 1619, the first cargo of Africans were carted off to Jamestown, Virginia from Angola on an English ship called the White Lion. The 20 Africans were captured in war and they were sold to Europeans who were exploring in America. Now, slavery was prevalent internationally. However, the slave trade was new to this young developing country. And over time, there was approximately 10 to 15 million enslaved individuals that were considered a part of the transatlantic slave trade. There are many stories that talk about how men had their wives and their daughters used as pawn. They were kidnapped in African countries. And this was a ploy that would draw out the men, the warriors. And when they would be captured, they were tied up and they were bound and gagged on the ships. They began to take the women as well, although the men were the original commodities. They began to take the women as well, and the women were forced to walk around naked and available to be raped and violated by all individuals on board. And what began to happen over time is that while initially they were looking for men, they realized that women carrying children became a 2-for-1. And so women oftentimes by the end of a journey, they either had just had a baby, were pregnant with the baby, or they were, had just given birth to one. I want you to understand that the African slave trade, the myth, one of the things that they used to utilize was the word of God. They used religion as an incentive for docility to ensure that Black people will be under control. And one of the selling points was that he got religion. So why do African Americans even believe in the European Christian God? To be honest with you, that is another story for another day. But the Western Christianity taught in America keeps minorities, even to this day, marginalized and oppressed. One of the things over the last 402 years that we have learned is to operate within the rules. And one of the things that has transpired is each time we've mastered the rules, the goalpost has been moved. But we're working on that. One of the ways to keep minorities in check or enslaved is something familiar with what you may have heard of today, but it started off as slave patrols. One of the objectives was to keep slaves in check. And so the slave societies of the American South, what they did was they formed slave patrols to control the slaves and enforce the slave codes, laws that attempted to regulate slave behavior. Slave patrols were usually locally organized groups of young white men, both middle-class slave owners and lower-class yeoman farmers. Patrollers generally had three main responsibilities. They were to search the slave quarters, disperse slave gatherings, and safeguard white commodities by patrolling the roads. Because property, the slaves were deemed property, economic resources for labor. And so this became a normative practice over time until January 1863. And this is when the US government quietly began to enlist Black soldiers to fight in the Civil War. Dissension was transpiring between the North and the South. And at the end of the Civil War, the genuine question regarding Black slaves or Black men who fought on behalf of their country, this caused additional headache and hardship. And this is what ultimately led President Abraham Lincoln to declare on January 1st, 1863, that all persons held as slaves within rebellious states, meaning the South, are and henceforward shall be free. And while he declared that in 1863, it was not until January 31st, 1865, that the 13th Amendment abolished slavery in the United States. It stated specifically, neither slave nor involuntary servanthood, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. That's section 1. Section 2 says Congress shall have power to force this article by appropriate legislation. One cannot ignore the flawed 13th Amendment. You see right there in black and white are preconditions and legal loopholes that were set up before anyone could ever recognize its impact. See, the exception to slavery or involuntary servanthood was written right in the law, in black and white, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. So there it is, you have it. How do we create legislation that keeps African Americans convicted as a collective? Welcome to the world of the caste systems. See, after the Civil War, during the Reconstruction era, the slave codes were basically switched to what became the Jim Crow laws. And we need to understand why. First, in recognizing what slave codes were, is rules and regulations that were established so that Black people would have to account for not only their whereabouts, but also be indebted to the people that they were working for, because again, the labor that had been given to them for free as property, white Americans with that land and property that needed to be owned, they still needed people to work the fields. And so all of these codes in different states would be set up and or established. And if these rules were not adhered to, then you would find yourself under subjection to be duly convicted of a crime or a debt to an individual to which you now had to be responsible to them. You see, when the Emancipation Proclamation was established, it did and was potentially disruptive to not only the economic, but also the political and social life in the antebellum years. So these slave codes were designed to keep Black people in check and indentured in the South. It was President Andrew Johnson that presided over the beginning of the Reconstruction era because of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And so in the years following Reconstruction, the South just reestablished many of the provisions of the Black clothes laws in the form of what we know today to be the Jim Crow laws. And they remained firmly in place for almost a century, but they were finally abolished with the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But the Jim Crow laws were the new system that evolved, and it became more sophisticated, less visibly obvious to the natural eye, unless you were the targeted audience. Black Wall Street. Nestled in the small town of Greenwood, Oklahoma, were a community of Black, Jewish, and Indian people who were forced to work together, but they did so successfully against all odds. They created the most prolific African-American community. And the history of the American Black Wall Street was that it was on a 36 square block section located in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and it housed doctors, lawyers, educators, business owners, and entrepreneurs. It was a community that was interconnected and interdependent because there were no other options that existed. You see, segregation prohibited African Americans from having access to necessary goods and services. So businesses were created to fill the need, the void that was had in that community. Laws were designed to keep the Black extended community classified as second-class citizens in this 36 square block radius. You see, segregation was in full effect, and it served as a legitimate, in their mind, legal replacement for slavery. It's that whole separate but equal. But it served as a beginning of a new caste system by white America. And so Black Americans and Indians were forced out of their homeland and southern states by the American government and powerful white hate groups throughout the South. And in the late 1800s, these Blacks and Indians migrated and settled into what is now known as Oklahoma. Sitting idly by and waiting for government resources and support was never even a consideration. So this Oklahoma territory, what happened is it remained independent, self-sufficient, and it was unique. Because they were forced to live on what was deemed undeveloped land, in their quest to create community, African Americans and Indians stumbled upon significant oil on the land, and this helped finance and create the wealthy, blended, integrated community of minorities. In this Black township, governed by their own laws, they were blessed with the resources that provided them the opportunity to not only survive, but thrive. At the height of Black Wall Street, you had 600 businesses, 21 churches, 21 restaurants, 30 grocery stores, 2 movie theaters, 6 private airplanes, 1 hospital, 1 bank, and their own school district. I need you to understand that the Black community did not self-destruct. There was indeed a strategic governmental organized attack on the community where the intention was to devastate the colored people who were surviving and thriving while white superior in their minds people were struggling. White Americans were living as second-class citizens economically, and in their minds, Black people were not deserving of such success and needed to be brought to their knees at all costs. And since the representatives of the Ku Klux Klan were not only in legislative positions, they were also in the criminal justice system. And they were also equipped with guns as local law officials. those police officers, it would just be simply a matter of time before African Americans would be destroyed. On May 31st, 1921, into June 1st, 1921, in a matter of an estimated 14 hours, the heart of the community was significantly damaged by mobs of envious whites who purposed to permanently devastate the entire culture. But make no mistake about it, Black Wall Street showed us that with resources and being left alone to create a standard of living ourselves and control over our lives without interference, that African Americans absolutely have the intellect, the resilience, the heart, and the ability not only to survive, but to be successful. Let me pause for a moment to express how I am a Black unicorn in this arena called economic empowerment and finances. There's a number to the right that is, or the number to your left that is deemed by CRD. Just by way of vocation, I am a certified financial planner, have been for the last 20 years, and there are still less than 1% of minorities that when I entered into the business that were deemed experts in this field. 20 years later, as of 2020, it has only moved from 1% to 1.7%. I'm also Series 76365 Life and Health license as well. If I don't know anything else, the one thing that I tell people all the time is I know Jesus and I know money. Which is why when we began to talk about the conversation of reparations, I want you to understand that this has not been a new practice. Reparations has been something familiar with America over time. As a matter of fact, September 11th in 1952, it was the New York Times that reported the first major move to end or make amends with the legacy of bitterness between Germany and the Jews. And so there was a willingness to right the wrongs of the Holocaust, which ended in 1945. This was an American priority. And if there were Jewish citizens of America, they were entitled to an apology accompanied by economic restoration as a result of the Holocaust. Things were put in place in order for that to happen. So why for the Jewish culture and community and not for African Americans for slavery, which along with the redressing of the 13th Amendment loopholes, this has never been taken considerately. Did minorities not deserve the same honor? America also paid remediation to Japanese Americans, recognizing that they have a responsibility, and I quote, that this is what the government said, to make amends by doing what? Giving compensation to satisfy one who has suffered injury or loss or wrongs at the hands of another. This is what America defines as reparations. Therefore, many remain consistent with that definition. It was the US Congress that passed the law for Japanese Americans, along with a resolution signed by President Ronald Reagan, which recognizes that injustice was done and an apology was offered by the nation for the acts of exclusion, removal, detention, and I quote, additionally accrediting the people, the Japanese Americans convicted for violating orders, they wanted to ensure that they were honored in what it is that they had endured. In addition to that, a foundation was established or created for education and humanitarian purposes. Last and not least, and most important, Congress established a $1.5 billion fund for the payment of reparations to the survivors of the intermediate camps. There should be fair, equal justice for all cultures who have been disenfranchised. On February 12, 2021, not 2002, not 1922, February 12, 2021, ABC News reported on a young Black couple who had purchased a home in 2016. After struggling to acquire the property in the first place, they were fortunate enough to become homeowners in a wealthy community in the area of San Francisco. After they moved into their home, which was originally built in the 1960s, their family staged major innovations. This particular couple added an entire floor, more than over 1,000 feet of space, and they didn't stop there. They built a deck, new floors, fireplace, added new appliances. And then they had the house appraised after investing over $400,000 in those renovations. The home had appraised for $989,000, or just $100,000 more than what the family got it appraised for prior to them doing the renovations. In other words, it had only appreciated $100,000 after they put in an additional $400,000 worth of work as a result of them being homeowners. Fortunately enough, the family immediately called their lender and recognized that there was a problem, and they pushed back on it. After a month of escalating their complaints and not giving up, this particular family were approved for a second appraisal. And what they decided to do is, on the day of inspection, they got creative with their particular process. They asked a white neighbor to pose as the homeowner. See, the first appraiser was an elderly white woman. The friend brought over some family pictures and made this Black couple's house look as if it belonged to her. That same home, 1 month later, appraised for $1.482 million, or roughly $500,000 more than it appraised just weeks prior to that. That change is equal to nearly 50% increase in value. Did I mention that this was in February 2021? February 12th, to be exact. The National Housing Act of 1934 created the Federal Housing Administration because there was identification that racial segregation and discrimination predated the establishment of FHA, but some of the policies aggregated the decay of urban housing by limiting access to mortgages or causing redlining or taking away the asset base of minorities that were looking to advance financially through home ownership. Even the Federal Home Loan Bank Board asked the Homeowners Corporation to create what we now know to be what is redlining. At that period of time, residential security maps related to the security of real estate investments, what it did is it created this color-coded desirability category. You see, if you had type A, it was green, and that was deemed as typically affluent suburbs. Type B was blue neighborhoods, and they were considered still desirable. Type C were older neighborhoods, labeled ones that were in decline. And type D, red, were generally older inner city neighborhoods considered most risky for mortgage support. And so if you were a minority with the opportunity to purchase a home, you are almost immediately geared toward and identified as a type D. And so you're already going to have your property appraisal and the value of your property be lesser than another individual that does not look like you. In 1948, the Shelley versus Kramer, the US Supreme Court rules that racially restrictive covenants in property deeds, those are unenforceable, but yet we still see that practice is happening today in 2021. The courts did find that although racial restrictive covenants are private, not governmental contracts, they are nevertheless legally unenforceable as they are in violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Regardless of what it is that we've been able to do, wealth has escaped the Black community. In the banking arena, after the Civil War, President Lincoln wanted to create financial literacy for African Americans so that they would have a smoother transition into freedom. The Freedom Bureau Act was the establishment to start a Black bank specifically for African Americans. But the push for the African-American upward mobility in the aftermath of slavery turned out to be a disaster in disguise. Arguably, the Freedom Bank was one of the worst economic implementations that occurred in the United States. You see, the Freedom Bank became one of the fastest growing banks in the United States, and it targeted only African Americans. At its peak, this bank had 37 offices in different cities such as Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. It had had around $57 million saved by African Americans across 17 different states. However, the Freedom Bank only allowed African Americans to save but not invest as equity owners in the bank's stock. In addition, it turned out that the Freedman Bank used its limited assets acquired by Black and brown bodies to loan funds to non-African Americans. And according to the Freedom Legacy Project, it was making a number of especially risky identified investments across the industries in the process. So that in 1873, Seneca Sandstone Company received an approval for an unsecured loan by a bank board member by the name of Henry D. Cook. The owner of Sandstone Company and the board members were all white. A financial panic occurred in 1873 throughout the United States. The quarry loan fell into default, and the depositors and the president of the board, what they tried to do in order to preserve and or save it is that they made Frederick Douglass, a Black man, the bank director. When Frederick Douglass found out about the loan that was given to Seneca, he desperately attempted to stabilize the bank. He even invested $10,000 of his own personal funds, but unfortunately later on that year, the bank was terminated. And yes, there was a congressional investigation of Henry D. Cook, and it was recommended. And what happened was Congress said that they would create a reimbursement system that would allow depositors to at least recover 62% of their savings accounts, but African Americans never received the compensation. This was the first touch of financial planning for the newly freed African American community. Many years thereafter, poured into generation after generation, Black people's savings mechanisms became money in the pillows, money in the mattress, money in the bosom. Life insurance. In 1693, it was Cotton Mather who noted in his diary the efforts of poor Negroes when they wanted to provide for the less fortunate amongst them. And what they would do when someone died was collect money to ensure that there could be a decent burial. In 1881, Prudential announced life insurance policies held by Black adults would be worth 1/3 less than the same plans held by whites. Weekly premiums remained the same for both groups. But the benefits for Black children did not change, but the weekly premium increased by 5 cents. You see, Prudential used some sort of statistical information to support its claim that the mortality rates for Blacks was higher than whites. In 1912, the National Association of Insurance Commissioners, they studied the abuses occurring in the Fraternal Benefit Society, and they identified potential regulatory actions. And they did know that some of the societies were targeting Black people with high premium and low value policies. In 1947, the first version of the Unfair Trade Practices Act was adopted by the NAIC membership. And this act defines and prohibits unfair discrimination for not only life, but health, property, and casualty insurance. And included in that denial is refusing to insure, refusing to renew, canceling or limiting the amount of coverage because of the geographical location of the risk, the age of a particular dwelling or housing, the sex of an individual, the marital status, sex or religion or national origin of an individual. Finally, in 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed, eliminating the discriminatory practices of charging different life insurance premiums based off of race that had been going on since the 1940s. See, life insurance charged Black customers higher premiums for so-called life industrial policies, cheap life insurance that was usually bought to cover burial costs. Some of you may recall the stories of your grandmothers and your grandfathers because it's really within our historical timeline in which someone would come and collect a premium. To this day, many minorities are still exposed to or sold whole life insurance policies as opposed to being offered other incentives that are available in order for minorities to accumulate and or acquire wealth. But I'm here to tell you that while all of that has transpired, we are in a place of opportunity. See, the difference today is that we have learned systematically and over time, we've acquired the education and the information that will give minorities the opportunity to acquire wealth. First of all, I do want to commend you in what it is that you're doing today, because where do we go from here? We recognize that with economic resources, minorities have the opportunity to level the playing field. And so now there are individuals that are committed to economic justice in society at large. And many individuals have now made it their business to become more well-informed and educated, recognizing that while there has been historical, systemic practices levied against minorities, their information is too broad, too vast out there in order for us to have an opportunity to build and acquire and accumulate wealth. And so I want to extend to you over these next few minutes, where do we go from here? I think that this is a season and a moment of opportunity. And one of the reasons why I suggested and began the beginning with a poem that says we have the right to be angry is to talk about the education that minorities have been able to acquire over the years. What has historically hindered or bounded us or kept us limited in our financial capacity to increase our standard and lifestyles of living was lack of education. Lack of education gave us lack of opportunity. But one of the things that we can glean from and learn from Black Wall Street is that in addition to creating our own table, entrepreneurship opportunities are still a wave of the future. The opportunity and the ability to have this discussion about how to advance from culture and communities. The three areas that I picked are areas in which helps us to accumulate our resources and where we have been oppressed and marginalized over time. And so how do we combat what has been historically challenging for us? In the area of real estate, even now with the appraisals in 2021, in order for us to be negatively impacted, because this is the greatest asset that all families, not just white, Black and white families alike, the greatest asset that most people have is in their home. So if your assets are taken out of your home, what are you to do? I want you to understand how important it is to be well-versed in where it is you're standing economically. When we recognize the significance of who it is that we are and what it is that we bring to the table, with excellent credit scores, high income, high wages, that we have the right to incentives in the banking industry to do what? To purchase real estate. Today, we're in a position now that education is our friend because it allows us the opportunity to do the research and still recognize what systemic oppression is out there. And when you have that systemic oppression, you have the opportunity to confront it. And so I have encouraged individuals and want to share this with us now as we find ourselves in this place and space where our income has increased, although COVID-19 has caused us to have some level of regression. But I'm going to touch on that in a moment. The model that Black Wall Street adopted and developed is a model that still can work in the 21st century. Because there were individuals that created their own system, their own methodology, their own avenues to be able to service and serve the needs of the people. That was a forced situation. We now have the opportunity to embark upon that ourselves today. We do recognize in the referencing of COVID-19 that in this last year and a half alone, 40% of the businesses that were employed by minorities have gone out of business because of disparity in economics once again. But the creativity and ingenuity to give us access to resources is the one thing that we want to hold on to. And so in creating the table, we also have the opportunity to create businesses, to become entrepreneurs. And I believe each one of us have that gift or that talent that can become our financial avenue to freedom and success, whatever that may be. The area in which you are gifted in is the area in which your financial ability is there for you to not only survive, but to thrive. And when doing that, everyone should have what is deemed or identified as the ultimate plan. The ultimate plan is a plan that allows you to focus on all areas of economics and adopt a practice or a policy for you and your family that, in spite of other individuals trying to hinder your ability to be successful, you have the opportunity to not only thrive, but also to achieve great financial success and stability. Here's the challenge that most people miss oftentimes. They miss the opportunity of education, which allows us to see that the access to information is available to all. What we've been able to see in this last year is that the economy and the stock market are two different entities. That one can be included in the stock market and be wealthy in the stock market, and the economy is still suffering. And so how do we confront that? How do we overcome that? I want to make sure that you walk away knowing that this is the methodology that we now have. In addition to entrepreneurship and opportunities that are there, each one of us have an opportunity to be financially free. We are starting from the bottom, but we now have the same access that other individuals have. Every individual who has the opportunity to work has an opportunity to begin saving and developing a plan of action for you and your current household. Usually working in major institutions, this is the information. That's why education is so important. This is the information that has never been passed on from generation to generation with a level of trust that you would have. And so let me start by saying this. Every individual, when given gainful employment, where they're working 24-hour, working a 40-hour work week in a major corporation, especially since we're talking to those that are currently going through school and pursuing some level of a degree with the opportunity or the desire to gain employment in the area in which you're studying in your vocation. You're all going to get this package. When you get this package, it's going to be this benefit package that covers almost all of the areas in which we have been deprived of from in the very beginning. In that package, it gives you an opportunity to begin to set up a financial freedom, a financial future for yourselves, even through retirement. You also have a package where the company will give you the opportunity to purchase life insurance, because if it's nowhere else where it's equalized, it is equalized in the workplace where discrimination has been banned. And so a family can start a journey right there. I tell all individuals that if you understand the principles of the models of comprehensive planning, how minorities are to accumulate and acquire wealth, these things that were taken away from us, then what you are able to do is lay the foundation for your family while we still fight to get economic justice. So yes, I do believe in reparations. But I also believe that while we're fighting for the chance to have equalization, equal employment, equal payment for men and for women, just allowing minorities to not get 30% less of a salary when your educational prerequisites and requirements or your educational resume is higher and or better, we must begin to demand that which it is that we're qualified to receive. And this is where we begin right now. We're able to fight both fights at the same time. We're able to start off where it is that we're standing and still ensure that even if I'm financially free, or even if my neighbor is financially free, when injustice is levied upon all of us, or any one of us, it affects all of us. And so these disparate areas, we not only have to share the information, we must find ourselves in a position where we're able to move forward. How do we do that? We do that by ensuring that we prepare our own families to set foundation. We have been targeted. We have been taken advantage of financially, but we now have the opportunity to not only build, but to build better and to build on top of where it is that we're starting from. So education being the first opportunity for individuals, and each of us need to make sure that we are the best in the field in which we select for ourselves, acquiring and accumulating education. Many individuals are recognizing that you are acquiring significant student debt in order to get in a place of opportunity. And we must continue to fight for, the laws to be changed in student ownership or in student loans overall. Each individual must recognize that life insurance is the way to leave a financial legacy for your family. But with education, we cannot be our grandparents. What our grandparents went through was being sold something that would not meet the particular need. And oftentimes people have not figured it out until the funeral was done. Where our grandparents were faithful in making sure that they made those premium payments, even with a disparate net death benefit that really did not basically cover the needs of what the families had. What our grandparents went through in acquiring insurance to ensure that we would be taken care of was step one. They showed us something, even though we were being taken advantage of, but you still have the opportunity to find out what are the needs of my family, because it is the greatest way and opportunity to send wealth transfer to the next generation. So we can no longer shy away from it. We must understand that it is a viable vehicle for us to be financially free. And so when we know better, we then begin to do better. And again, that comes through us understanding that if we find people that are entrepreneurs in the areas, much like Wall Street. See, Wall Street had to meet the needs of the people in their cluster and their community. They had no other option but to trust in those that they were working with, and those that wanted to be successful in their endeavors did what? They provided the best quality of service, and everyone was able to thrive. And so you have individuals in these different areas. And it was, Dr. Francis Cress Welsing that tells us how important it is for us to be entrenched in non-people area activities so that we can have some level of impact and or influence in those areas so that our culture and our community can be well-versed, whether you are in the area of law, whether you are in the area of politics, whether you are in the area of religion, wherever that area is, you have a responsibility to community. If we're going to recreate economic wealth, then our community has a responsibility to filter out into all of these areas so the impact and the influence that we can have in these different areas that really target and really dictate where it is that we're standing, it will allow us to be able to be successful. With the knowledge that you're able to bring forth to the community, this is how we work together. And so you need individuals that are policymakers. You need individuals that are influencing our educational system. You need individuals that are influential even in law enforcement. The people area activities that we must be deeply entrenched in allows for our voices to be heard. And I will dare say this. There was a period of time in which the church was the place, that center of influence that allowed minorities to gain not only the trust of the community, the trust of their leaders, the trust of the influencers in these particular areas. And so if the church would stand up and recognize the level of influence that they can have, then we advocate as a collective body of individuals that are demanding economic justice for our culture and our community. It is possible for all of us to be financially free. And while we have historically been targeted and marginalized and oppressed. The one thing that has occurred from generation to generation is that those that have been oppressed and marginalized, after a while, they are conditioned to that situation or circumstances until they're shown another way out. For example, if any individuals are dog lovers, if you keep a dog encaged for an extended period of time, closed up, if you keep them within a particular barrier or parameter, even if you open up the door, oftentimes the dog will not attempt to walk out. But if you go and you get the dog and you walk them out through the door, then there's a whole nother world that is available unto them. In this day and age, we have endured much, but in 402 years, we have accomplished a lot. And what we have the ability to do now is take all of the things that we have learned. See, the shoulders that I stand on allows me to talk about economic empowerment, economic justice, so that when the likes of a Dr. Nicole B. Simpson comes along and has conversations with individuals such as yourselves, that you are successful in your arena, your area, your subject matter of expertise. All of us have a contribution that we're capable of making to society at large. And what it allows for us to do is to ensure that that which had kept us in bondage is no longer a viable threat to keep us in bondage today. See, the domino effect of slavery on African Americans has lost its effectiveness from generation to generation. So I simply leave with you, what are you going to do to advance our cause? Because we have space and opportunity in the 21st century, not only to survive, but to thrive and to be economically sustainable. Each one of us have the opportunity to do such a thing. Education is the great liberator. That's what Dr. Benjamin Mays has said. And each one of us have the ability to not only reach for the stars, but to reach for the stars to change the world. I want to thank you for your time on tonight, and I turn it over for questions and answers to anyone that may have one at this time.
All right, you guys, we are monitoring the chat, so if you do not feel comfortable coming off of mute, go ahead and write questions that you may have in the chat, or any thoughts that you may have. So Carrie says she just wants to thank you for elaborating on Black Wall Street. I should know more, but they don't teach it enough. Debbie would like to thank you as well. Let's check our Facebook live stream, see if there are any questions in there as well. Jared says, thank you so much for speaking tonight, Doctor.
My pleasure. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Carrie says, how did you learn about Black history, and how do you suggest those who don't have the information look for more?
Well, I should probably give my my background. I graduated from Oral Roberts University, and then I went to seminary at New Brunswick Theological Seminary, and I studied urban ministries as a part of a discipline during my seminarian journey, where I got my Master of Divinity. And then I graduated from Boston University, and my whole life journey, we had been taught history through our families, but I targeted understanding economics and history from an early age because I stumbled in. So let me backtrack just for a moment, because I stumbled into the industry that I'm in. I am a teenage mother by vocation, and I blew a 4-year scholarship to Seton Hall University, and I needed to get a job. And I was fortunate enough to stumble into this field, the financial planning field or the securities industry, back in 1991. And I was the only person that looked like me in that area. And so that was disconcerting to be first on Fifth Avenue. I was on Fifth Avenue up in, where FAO Schwartz is in New York City, and then down in the World Trade Center area. So to be a minority in this industry was sticking out like a sore thumb in the first place. And so that caused me to begin to study about finances, because I was learning something that was foreign to our culture and our community at large. And so I am also a World Trade Center survivor, worked on the 73rd floor of 2 World Trade Center. And after 9/11, I made it my life purpose to begin to teach individuals how to recover from financial disaster. And so that's primarily what it is that I do. But I was coming across some challenges, some apprehension of our culture and community, because they weren't really, one, familiar with finances. 2, they had horror stories about, whether it be housing or banking or insurance tell stories. And so I realized that a lot of education needed to be had. And so while I had been somewhat knowledgeable about history in the first place, between my educational journey, my financial journey, and my desire to educate and educate and communicate information to our community, I needed to become more astute in what it is that I was teaching. And I was fortunate enough to, build up some level of credibility to be able to put history and the challenges of our history with where it is that we are, coupled with the expertise that I now have to be able to educate and empower. So that's been my journey. And it's been a challenging one, but a beautiful one indeed. Because I do believe if we do not know our history, we are destined to repeat it. That's why I'm always advocating that we take a little extra time to learn about our finances, especially because we all do have the opportunity and the ability to become financially free and set our families up. We don't oftentimes have the information. So my life goal is to ensure that when I die, I would have helped at least 1,000 families become a millionaire. And so it goes through forums and opportunities of teaching other individuals, how do we get there?
Okay, and then it looks like Kate has a question. What made you want to become a reverend?
I don't think we get a choice in that. I am a reverend simply because after 9/11, although I have always been a woman of faith, after 9/11, I felt the urgent call to preach the gospel message. And if doing that, and I did, I thought that it was important for me to get the education behind it. I do believe that when you are a minority, you have a responsibility to, do what you're good at. But you get so much more credibility when you become an expert in what it is that you say that you're good at. And so for someone that has been called to preach the gospel, when I ultimately went back to school, because I got my CFP before I got my college degree. When I ultimately went back to school, I went back to school understanding that I was called to preach the gospel.
Okay, and it looks like Jesse from our Facebook has a question. When is it a good time to teach my children about finances, and what should I cover?
So I began at an early age teaching my children by exposing them to some of the companies that they take advantage of every day. So if I were a mother, let me just use myself as an example, what I did with my children. Back years ago, I used to drink a lot of Pepsi, and their grandmother began to work, was working for PSC&G, two publicly traded companies. And so in my teaching them about what it is that we enjoy as consumers and what it is that their grandmother did as her vocation, I taught them about owning the companies that people utilize all the time. And so just exposing them, to those areas I made talking about money comfortable. So we oftentimes say as parents, money doesn't grow on trees. So teach them how to correlate money with working, correlate money with investments, correlate money with dividends. And so when they got their first stock, I made sure that they got a stock that offered a dividend check so that they would be accustomed to receiving a check in the mail. And so we passed that practice on. And the moment that my children became of age, and they got their first job, as a parent, I immediately showed them, and this is what every parent should do. When your child gets their first job, well, I shouldn't just say every parent, this is free information for all of you. If you're at your job, let me just tell you, as soon as you get your first full-time job, your company generally, depending on where it is that you work, your company offers you a benefit package. If they offer you the benefit package, open up the package. Usually when you're young, 18, 19, you want all of your check, but I promise you, you won't even feel it. So open up the package and immediately sign up for your IRA account. It might be a 401k, 403b, but it's some sort of retirement vehicle. And what you ought to immediately do is find out how much money is your company going to give you if you put money inside. It's called a company match. So I taught my children almost immediately. I said, give me a check. We looked at their benefits package, and because they live with their parents typically, you don't need all of this, so sign up now. And I showed them what the match would look like. Most people feel like you're overworked and underpaid anyway if you're working for somebody else. So make sure you're at least taking advantage of that amount that has that the company says that they're going to give you. And so that's what I did for my children. I made them feel comfortable with the conversation about money. And then I showed them how to build. And I remember my daughter just turned 25. And, a few months ago, she's my youngest. And, the first time I showed her that when she got to $10,000, it was like, oh, wow, this is awesome. And so for a 25-year-old, well, she wasn't 25 when she got it because she started when she was younger, but you understand what I'm saying. When someone hits their first 1,000, then they hit their first 10,000, and then they hit their first 25,000, and then they hit their first 100,000, it is a wonderful feeling, that sense of security that you may not see that you can get it, but the first place that everyone should start is through retirement savings. I know it feels like you can't touch the money until you're 59 and a half, but I promise you, you're probably going to be alive at 59 and a half. You're probably going to still need clothes and food and shelter and all of that other stuff. But if you really want to create some level of financial stability, the first thing that you ought to do is begin to save for your retirement, no matter how young you are. And parents, if you have children that are working part-time jobs, open up a banking account with them, show them how their bank is accumulating, and then set them up so that they can begin to invest in the arena in which all of us are investing in as well. Because the stock market is really a place where wealth is accumulated. I was fortunate enough to stumble into the industry as a teenager. I try to expose everybody I possibly can to all facets of comprehensive financial planning. But my expertise is in investment.
Thank you so much for that answer. I definitely agree with that. As soon as I got my first job, I was like, you know what? They're going to pay me to put money into my own account? Sure. One last question. Debbie says, how did you get over the traumatic events of September 11th? I had just graduated from high school when I woke up and saw the Twin Towers had been hit by an airplane.
If I told you, that's a whole nother seminar. So let me just say this, and I'll try to make it very, very quickly in that regard. And this is the preacher in me, because it took me a long time to really get to that place to do that. But there is a story in the Bible. It's a story about 3 Hebrew boys called Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. When I had endured the tragedy of 9/11, something else came up for me, some historical childhood trauma in my past. And so when that trauma arose for me, one of the things that I had to deal with, it was the overlaying of trauma. And that happens in our lives. When you go through traumatic experiences, one thing can trigger something else that you were not anticipating happening. And so I had to begin to unpack some childhood trauma overall and begin to deal with and accept that there is really nothing that I can do to change what happened on 9/11. There was a lot of resentment. I was young, Black, 30 years old, CFP, which is, again, a Black unicorn in my industry. I felt like my entire career had been stripped from me. And so it took a lot of hard work, talking to counselors and working on reinventing and creating myself to be able to deal with the tragedy of 9/11. And I'm not really sure if any of us are really overcomers of it. I do know that we are capable of coping with it, and that which does not kill you will make you much stronger. And I am definitely stronger today as a result of what it is that I endured on 9/11. But to finish up, the story from the Bible, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, talks about three individuals going into a fiery furnace. And it was designed to kill them. But at the end of the story, it did not kill them. And the one thing that is a scripture that says, when they came out of the fiery furnace, there was no smell or no singe on them. And that right there spoke to me that that which did not kill me does not have to hinder me from moving forward for the rest of my life. There is a recovery. There is an opportunity to move forward and thrive, even though I had gone through that devastating moment. And that right there is what still keeps me to this day. And so I'm very grateful to have, come across that particular area in my life. And it has helped with different levels of trauma for not only myself, but other people as well.
Thank you so much for going into that. And you guys, Dr. Reverend Nicole Simpson will be joining us again on the 28th. So if you did not get to ask any questions or didn't get to converse as you wanted to, she'll be joining us for our conference panel on the 28th at 11 a.m. Mountain Standard Time. If you are in Eastern Time, that is 1 p.m. Eastern Time. So thank you so much for joining us, and thank you, Nicole, so much for speaking with us. We loved it today, and we can't wait to have you back. You guys can check out our Facebook page. If you did miss the beginning of this recording, it is streamed live and will be uploaded to YouTube, as well as check out some of her books. She is a published author.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you guys for joining us on Zoom, and thank you for joining us on Facebook Live as well. We can't wait to see you guys back.